Values and decision making in personal ministry. Productive Pastor 77. What's going on, friends? Chad here. Great to have you back on the podcast. I've been waiting for this episode. Full disclosure here. I've had this episode sitting in an outline form in my drafts for probably 2 months. I couldn't figure out why I didn't want to turn it loose. I felt like it wasn't ready. And I think what it was really trying to find the hook. Find out, okay, Chad, what makes this a Productive Pastor episode and not just some other content that you write around the internet or share, that sort of a thing. And you know, earlier this week, I realized where it fits into those 4 content pillars. And this is about strategic thinking, but this is also about productive leadership. And it's kind of based off of an episode from last summer. So a year and a half ago, episode 14 of the show, Personal Ministry Vision. We're just talking about transitions in my life and transitions in ministry. And I've been thinking about that ever since then. I've actually have a lot of coaching that goes on around that idea. Since that episode a year and a half ago, I've walked multiple pastors through the idea of creating a personal ministry vision document and how that applies to their current ministry and how that applies to future ministry. So I've been thinking about this. So in a lot of ways, this is a part 2 of that. So make sure you go to the show notes, revchadbrooks.com/PPP/077. You're going to find a lot of links to stuff because the show's been around long enough now for us to have backlinks. And episode 14 is one of the things I'll be talking about. I'll also, episode 19 about clarity and priorities in decision making is an episode you might want to check out, as well as episode 44 about our yeses and our nos. It's another episode about decision making, because that's really where this comes into the Productive Pastor conversation. So before we jump into that, just let you know, if you're curious about what it might look like to have a coaching relationship to talk specifically about this idea and some of the stuff I'm talking about here is one of my primary coaching conversations I have with pastors, and I am booking up my 2024. And so if you want to jump into a coaching relationship, now is the time to talk about it. Now's the time to get that scheduled, to get that ball rolling. And this is one of the things that more people have found helpful than anything else, so much where I've kind of rolled it together into a very specific coaching program now, all about personal ministry vision. Now, a couple books have played into this episode. I read them both this summer, and in my own reading, I have if it's a physical book, which I prefer physical books, I've got a little yellow flag. Yellow flags mean content, and I'm looking through 2 books, and I see a bunch of yellow flags and Post-it notes sticking out of it. And what's wild is it was really reading these 2 books that had me coming back to this conversation about decision making and core ministry vision and values. This sort of thing. Now, the first book is called Leadership on the Line. It's an older book. It's by Ronald Heifetz and Marty Linsky. These are the 2 cats that coined the term technical versus adaptive challenge. And this book is really where that idea comes from. And I've learned a lot in it, but so much what I've learned about in Leadership on the Line is what happens and how you have to know yourself for when tough decisions have to be made, and what does it mean to lead people through difficult things and through changes and all of that. So I'm going to talk about that book is some of this episode, but then also a newer book I picked up this summer on vacation. The cover looked good, the title looked good, and then I read the back of it and said, Chad, you need to read this book, and it's called The Yellow Pad by Robert Rubin. He's a former Secretary of the Treasury. And I picked it up just because my dad always keeps a yellow pad with him everywhere. And I thought it'd be more of a book about thinking, but it's a book about decision making. And I'm reading it, and he's going through difficult decisions he had to make in business, difficult decisions he had to make in government, through the Clinton administration, and all sorts of stuff. And I realized this is coming back to that personal vision piece, this thing that I've been helping pastors with for the last year and a half, this thing that I think about and that I'm realizing in my own current ministry context matters. I'll talk about that a little bit more, but some of it has to go with what I talked about in the last episode about how Clifton Strengths affects my leadership. So those two books, the links to those in the show notes, but two great reads. But this is what I'm realizing. So I'm pulling from both those books, pulling from other stuff, pulling from my own thoughts, is this. Values are your anchors. Values anchor us. When we find tension in life, we can create tension against our values. We can create stability with our values. And then also we can create trust, especially when things feel like absolutely cattywampus. It's our values that we can trust. So our values are anchors in multiple different ways. And who we are is our knowledge. And our values are going to be the beginning and end of every decision that we make. These values help explain who we are. And this is the deal. You already have them. You might not know them or you might not have ever named them, but you have some values that are driving the way you do things and you lead things. And so they're the beginning of every decision. They're the end of every decision. So much of what I've learned from Leadership on the Line is realizing that change is going to confront the things that are sacred to us. And it's a lot easier to, tear down golden calves when we realize what actually is true about ourselves. The better we know these things, the better we know ourselves. Module 1 of the Becoming Productive course, the first episode, the reboot of the podcast, was about being personally aware. The better we know these things, the easier decisions will be. And this is where I realized finally this is a productive pastor conversation. Because think about all of the decisions that you have made in ministry leadership in the last few years. Think about this. Think about how many decisions you made from March 15th of 2020 to August 1st of 2020. I remember reading in so many places about decision fatigue, and then anyone who was leading anything at work, ministry, however it was, that you probably made more decisions in that span of time than you would make or had made in your life. Decisions can be paralyzing. And when you get into ministry, one of the things that we don't really realize is how much of the mind space we have can be made up with making decisions. And so our decisions are directly related to our core values, this piece of who we are, because they are filters. They help us understand, well, how will I do X? Or what will I do when X happens? And you are already living with things like this. You're already living with these values, but if you've never named them, you don't understand the way they're going to drive you. But also you're going to probably be relatively self-limited in the way that you choose to do things. For me, my vocational role has changed a lot in the last few months. And one of the things that has moved into my value set in the last year, it was on my broader understanding of core ministry, but it was much further down the line. Now it is at the place of core value. Is I look through so many situations and realize, Chad, is the best thing for me to be in this place to simply be a coach. And what that means inside of that is the best thing for me to do right now is to be curious and to ask questions. I might not be asked to lead this thing. Also, something I've learned about myself in the last few years is I literally have no desire whatsoever at all to be in charge. But that gets difficult when you get to kind of a certain station in life. And I've realized so many times I'm in a room, I'm at the table, I'm there for big conversations and realizing, what if my only job, the best thing for me to be doing right here is to be thinking about my approach to these conversations as a coach by being curious, by asking questions. So that's that filter. Like, am I being curious right now, or am I trying to be way too prescriptive and just say this is what we need to do? And I can catch myself, I can lead myself in that. Also another thing, and this is part of mine, it's been part of mine since I started articulating this stuff really 2 or 3 years ago in my journal, is that faithfulness is a huge thing to me. I go back to those words of Jesus that are all throughout the Gospels. To much is given, much is expected. And I look at things and sometimes I simply say, okay, what is the most faithful thing to do right here? How am I being a steward of this? I had to make a decision, a pretty big decision, but I made it really, really quickly a couple of days ago about some business stuff. And I realized, well, the more faithful thing is to do X. Also come in some core, because for me, so many of my own personal ministry values, and I've worked with, probably a dozen pastors at least over the last year fully with this content, and a lot more just kind of coming in and out. Everyone's core values look different. For me, there are a lot of, they don't sound like core values. It's words like faithfulness. It's words like gracious and generous. And so I made a decision relatively quickly and to call somebody back and say, hey, listen, forget what we just talked about. This is what I'm going to do, because I realized there was a more faithful way to trust that allowed me to make a decision based off of generosity, because that's who I am. Like that's at this core. And I've gotten to the point to where I'm able to understand those sorts of values as decision-making filters. But we also have core ministry assumptions. And this is a huge thing for us too, because this is the deal. You get to assume things. I remember when I was in seminary, I was taking a 700 level class of the exegesis of the Catholic epistles with Dr. Ruth Ann Reese at Asbury Seminary. And she was super awesome. This being a 700 class, she realized everyone taking it was thinking about doctoral work. And so she told us, I'm going to grade y'all as though y'all are anticipating doctoral work. And so every paper we had to write, we had to turn in at least one rough draft, if not two rough drafts, and then the final rough draft. And on my first rough draft I sent into her, the first page was covered in red at the bottom, and it was about, I was assuming things about the kind of worldview of people thinking about stuff. And she wrote down the bottom of it, she said, hey, Chad, this is an assumption. You don't need to do this right here, but you get to make assumptions, but tell me in a footnote about your assumption. And I learned at that point in time right there, yeah, we get to make assumptions. Just make sure people know our assumptions. I was teaching a workshop a couple of weeks ago on guest integration, and I told people, hey, listen, so here's the thing. I came out of big evangelical church in the 90s. I've got some core assumptions, and one of my core assumptions are healthy things grow. And I'm expecting healthy churches to grow because reaching other people is primary to me. And I've learned I have to name this because there have been times in the past I've made decisions that were not the right decisions because I did not understand that as a core driving assumption for me. So like sometimes sticking to these core assumptions can be dangerous. Maybe sometimes when does sticking to that core assumption cause me to take a different role? When I get really, really passionate in a negative way, is that a real passion, or am I simply unknowingly getting frustrated or whatnot because my values are being challenged? Like, am I actually theologically disagreeing with someone at a core level, or do they just not have some of the same basic frameworks and assumptions that I do? I've learned this the hard way. I look back at my ministry career, and it was always new people. And for the last year, I'm having to think about discipleship for the first time. And I'm realizing, Chad, you had one really good thing going in there, but you could not take care of other situations and other people. And that sort of thing is going on because your core assumption is this. And so you get to name your assumptions, but it's important for you to realize those things because you might be sometimes making the wrong decision. So all of this understanding of your core ministry assumptions helps you understand why this matters, because you will make better decisions, you will make decisions quicker, and you will make decisions that are more in line with not just who you are, but where you are ministering in the context of that at the moment, because that's where this, in a beautiful way, this idea of personal ministry vision comes together as how you're able to lead different contexts throughout your career. And so when I think back to so many times I'm making decisions and I look at the decision I made, it's not a second guessing, but I'm going to run it through a filter real quick. and just ask myself, hey, Chad, is this immediate decision the best? Is this immediate reaction the best? Have you asked all the questions you need to ask? Have you been curious enough? Is there perhaps somebody who needs to be doing this in a more visible way than you? Can you, it's got to the point in time, one of my personal values is like what I say yes to leading and being in charge of is very specific now because I'm going to activate. Kind of goes back to the strength things from last episode. Starting things is huge for me. So am I going to say yes to something that's going to require long-term maintenance? It's kind of how it is. There's a quote from the Yellow Pad that I love here. It says this: the right approach to crisis management begins not with managing the crisis, but managing ourself. And so here's the thing. If you don't have clarity over who you are and what are those core ministry assumptions that create those core ministry values, when everything goes crazy, you're going to struggle to manage that and to lead through that because you don't know who you are or who you might be just yet. And these are the things that they rarely change. If anything, stuff gets added because you've gained clarity over yourself and you've realized that something is a lot more important to you than you might have initially realized. So the second piece is where this flows out of kind of the unchanging personhood is now the space of change, the space of adaptability, the space of contextual ministry. Those places that you are going to be in throughout your career, because even if you stay at the same church, my dad was at the same church from the age of 24 to 66. I mean, it's incredible. It might have been longer than that. But he was there, but his job title changed several times over those years. And then for the last 20-something years where he was a senior pastor, that church changed and shifted. He led that church starting, I think he became senior pastor in 2000. So you see that massive transition there. He'd already been at the church on staff for 20 years. You see leading that church through the 2008 financial crisis. They were about to build a brand new sanctuary. Leading the church through stability through the end of a 35-year master plan and building that sanctuary. And then leading the church through COVID. The church changed. He changed. Even if you're in the same place, your context is going to shift and change. So this quote coming up, and I read it in the Yellow Pad, but it's from a man named Steve Friedman says this. It's about strategic dynamism. So this is when we're in an environment where tactics and long-term strategy shift and adapt, but our values and principles remain constant. And so the way that we function in fluid places, whether we're moving or the context of the church is changing, all that sort of stuff, we have to adapt that. We have to move. We have to think. We have to lead. We have to manage change, all that sort of stuff. But we do that when we ourselves are unchanging. And I tell you, friends, I think this is like deeply scriptural as well. I can look in the language of the Psalms, and it's like I can really easily get to this point in Scripture. I have no problem with this. But you think about this, like when the world around you, when the environment changes, when things become fluid, are you staying the same? Are you changing constantly to meet the new ministry situation you're in? Is the level of reinvention that you might have to do when you move, is that becoming inauthentic and distrue to who you are? Or are you realizing that things are changing and instead say, okay, this is the place where I stay the same. This is the way I might have to change my approach to things. I might have to lean more into one of these values that is the tension is coming there, that sort of a stuff. But it's holding it in equal hands, realizing the changing of the situation, but also the unchanging nature of who you are and how you proceed in life and how you proceed in ministry, especially when you come up to ministry walls. And I've written about ministry walls a lot. I've kind of given them lip service on the podcast. I've not talked about them so much, but ministry walls are these things that we run up against and we have to get over. But the difficult thing is if we try to get over them on our own, we're going to exhaust ourselves. Just like if we're trying to climb a wall, we have to have other people helping us in multiple ways to get over those. But when we hit a ministry wall, think of some of the greatest leadership challenges you might have had during the 2020, 2021 era. How do you handle massive change like that and the role of leading inside of change without changing yourself? If I think of my own life in 2021, 2022, I changed. And in the times where I was really, really frustrated, what I didn't realize was what was coming up was tremendous tension against my core values. And sometimes what I was reacting to was the fact that I felt a value piece of who I am, who God made me to be, and how I've been kind of created and called to lead. That was being threatened. Sometimes it was my core ministry assumptions were being threatened. That whole growth piece is like, hey, we're growing, you need to leave me alone. And that caused conflict. And so much of this is understanding, who we are and being sure and stable in that, but then realizing how we can be adaptable in other places. Maybe the question is, how do we change tactics and behaviors in line with our values in order to respond to the current moment and current context? What do we need to be doing the most right now? What will be the most helpful to the people we are doing this with and the people we are doing this for? And sometimes what that might mean is leaning on parts of your values that are most appropriate in that situation, and maybe telling other parts of your core values, hey, listen, it's not saying you don't matter, but you might not be needing to be leading the charge in this moment. Some of this goes back to strength conversations. And so the last bit, just really quick to follow this up, to kind of wrap it up in a practical way, to talk about development and growth, because hopefully by now you're catching this larger vibe of what I've been doing, is that I'm thinking about what does it mean for us to grow? Call it me hitting middle age 43. I'm about to be at the point in time in my life where I have primarily gotten a paycheck from a church for 20 years. But I also look back and say, I want the next 20 years to be great. So what does it mean for me to adapt, for me to grow, for me to level up, all those sorts of things? But how do we do that in a healthy way? How do we do that in a way that is not disauthentic to who Jesus made us to be? And I think this language of personal ministry vision and working through this grid, having conversation partners to help us discern, to get this down on paper, to make this a formal thing that we can have access to, it matters. I'm redoing mine right now. Like I said at the front end of the episode, if you're sitting here and thinking, Chad, you know what? I need to do this, reach out. There's a link in the show notes, or you can just hit me up on a DM on any of the socials, what that might look like. I can send you information. It's like an 8-session type of coaching relationship, and so we can get that stuff. I put there's assessments in there. There's Clifton Strengths. There's Workplace 5. Like, friends, this is a really, really just strong thing to do when you're hitting that mid-career, that mid-career point where you're starting to ask questions. But more so than that, just encourage you, just spend the time thinking about, what are these core parts of my vision? Go listen to episode 14. There's some stuff in those show notes are there. You can kind of see a little bit of the grid, all that kind of stuff. But think through there, who are you at your core, and how is that worked out in the way that you are currently ministering right now? Episode 14 gets much more prescriptive. You can see what the framework looks like there. But thanks so much for listening. Come hang out with Productive Pastor Community on Facebook. The Productivity Party. Also have some kind of cool things up my sleeve for this fall, and just kind of putting the cool things up the sleeve notice out there. But thanks so much for tuning in to the podcast. I will be back in our next episode with another one that's been sitting in the crock pot for far too long. But hit me back up. Tell me about what you're thinking of these core ministry vision and values and how this can change things for you. Thanks so much. I'm out. See you back the next episode.